Hello everyone. Today we're here to discuss the cost of moving from Dynamics AX 2009 or Dynamics AX 2012 onto the Microsoft D365 for Finance and Operation platform in the cloud. And the topic is performing a cost analysis first. My name is Nicolette Richards, and I'm intentionally leaving my title off the slide because I come from you to bring you this information from various perspectives. As a former customer and customer project manager, a partner project manager, as well as a functional consultant and as a Microsoft Gold partner, my intention is to provide information that's relevant to every aspect of the project. So the objective is to prepare you with the knowledge that you can bring back and confidently move forward with your intentions to implement your new ERP platform. We have roughly 45 minutes to cover this material, and it's going to start in quite a general manner before I drill into more specific details. Here are the agenda items listed out. We're going to cover three main objectives. There's a questionnaire, which will cover the purpose of your attendance for this discussion. We'll cover some of the things that will influence costs, as well as we'll touch on licensing and a number of other areas with respect to planning for costs. Three main objectives are to, upon completion, to be able to anticipate the types of hidden costs and standard costs that will commonly be incurred during the implementation. Also, for you to be able to plan for costs that you will incur during and even after the initial implementation, and to help you to plan for the different implementation models based on their cost differences. So, as for the questionnaire, there are 3 points. And rather than pose a question, we'll just indicate that. Now, with respect to the questionnaire, there are most likely people that are looking to plan their fiscal budgets for 2020. There are people that are currently planning for an implementation that will happen not in 2020, but after or soon after. And there are going to be some people that will also be in the middle of a migration or implementation. Okay, so let's get into the presentation. Before I delve into the quantifiable analysis of costs, I want to share this graphic. And by now, I imagine many people have seen some variation of this diagram. And what it basically conveys is that below the surface level costs that we are initially presented with, the explicit costs that we'll see in our statement of works or in our or we'll have presented to us in the estimates, there are other categories of expenses that will inevitably arise during the cycle of an implementation. To name a few, we have the training, hardware, such as when you're dealing with a cloud, you still are going to be responsible for printers. There's handheld devices and tablets and PCs that will be required to support this operation. And as well, there's the consultation services. These are the costs that we've come to expect, but to what degree should we be able to expect to incur these costs? What many people have a harder time gauging is just by how much these costs will accumulate and what can determine if these costs will accumulate. What I've laid out is what I call the factor 10. And now these are some of the variable costs that are likely to arise during the course of the project, right? These are the types of things that will influence the costs as you implement. And these are my suggestion for you to take into consideration as you plan your implementation project. And I'll go into each in a further slide. So when we look at employees, there are, these things are we can call soft factors because we can't, for the most part, quantitatively analyze or predict how these will influence costs, right? Not with exact certainty, but these still have a really significant impact on your project. And if you have the way to help mitigate some of the risk associated to these areas, then it's advisable to do so. for the sake of budget, for the sake of timeline, and just for the sake of the overall success of your implementation. And I refer to these as soft because you usually cannot measure these. For example, we cannot definitively say that there's going to be a 45% resistance to change, but we know that we can plan to manage that resistance. Right? When we're talking about employees, these are the people that turn the gears in the organization. Some people have the ability to manage up, and some people have the ability to manage down based on the relationships that they have cultivated in the organization over their tenure in that company. And you want to bring the right people in your team, influence the people who have the ability to influence a broader audience so that you are in alignment and you all are working towards the same goal. I've seen many cases where if an employee is not on board, then it drags the project. It takes longer to be successful in getting other subject matter experts in your organization to follow and contribute in the manner that's required for that implementation to be successful. When we talk about the goals and scope, you want to ensure you have a targeted timeline. Suggested that you slice your project into reasonable goals, minimizing the customizations, right? In many companies, they're trying to go for the big bang approach, but the big bang approach is really not a recommended method in terms of implementing. If you can implement some of your core processes first and gradually build on additional features, then it actually gives you a bit better chance of success rather than to spend months and months, if not years, working up to having the full 100% perfect solution before you cut over. A part of what I also observe is that when we're going for this big bang approach, when we're piling on a number of different customizations, integrations, and pulling so many aspects of the business into that first phase of the project, the level of complexity will quickly increase. The amount of time you're spending in your meetings, going back and forth on decisions, and sometimes even bringing in an unnecessary customization that drags the project in a number of ways, including costs, right? Another factor that influences cost is actually your industry, right? Depending on what industry your organization fits in, your needs for the software is going to vary. For example, if you're strictly a financial institution who just use the software for the general ledger and the accounts payables and accounts receivables, you're not using the full breadth of the system. And therefore, the timeline generally is going to be a typically shorter implementation. And the number of resources that you need to support the implementation will typically be a lot less. If you're doing a really huge implementation, or you've got manufacturing and supply chain and distribution, then you're talking about a much wider set of features that you're going to, one, evaluate, two, aim to implement, and then three, if you do aim to implement, if you have any modifications around there, you're also bringing those into scope. So your footprint, the footprint of your use of the system grows significantly based on your industry, or shrinks based on what your industry is. Some of the things that are also going to impact your costs are your integrations, right? So if you have integrations with a third-party logistics supplier, or you've got integrations where you want to automate some of the banking transactions that are coming in or going out of your system, then of course that's also going to have an impact with the cost of the implementation. Another important factor that I do want to mention here is leadership and leadership style. And this is an extremely soft factor, but it's an important one because good leadership generally leads to successful projects. And if there's a lack of leadership in driving the project from initiation to completion with clear set goals, clear set timelines, and management of the overall group, then that's going to really have a significant impact on that project. If the business cannot assign individuals, and this could be a steering committee, this could be just really strong subject matter experts. Your leadership, how you divide up your leadership is really going to vary based on your organization. But what's critical is no matter how it's divided up, there needs to be the ability to make firm decisions, someone to be accountable for those decisions, and also to have a team of people who are not afraid to make decisions because of repercussions. Because in these projects, nothing always goes right 100% of the time. And there has to be room to make mistakes and be okay with moving forward after a mistake is made. That's also a really important tenet of leadership, is allowing your team to learn through their mistakes and do something better the next time around. All right, so I'm going to finish up on the slide with soft factors, and then I do want to jump over to there's a cost analysis worksheet which kind of shows how some of these factors will influence your costs based on, there's a cost analysis worksheet that accompanies this presentation, which is used to help demonstrate how some of these soft factors that we discussed can have a direct influence on costs. All right, so before I do that, let's continue with these last five. Location, right? So the location of your organization or your various business units, and that could be a single location. You could have a handful, or you can have hundreds of locations across the country or across the globe. Travel and travel expenses, while they don't account for a major portion of your overall costs, they do still have an influence, right? And having being in a location that requires a lot of travel, in many cases you will have to fly consultants in to support your implementation. If you are in a geographical location where there's a huge business hub, financial hub, you will most likely have resources already co-located in your vicinity. Otherwise, you would have to be you'd need to account for the travel expenses. Process maturity, another important factor in terms of whether whether you're really ready to implement any system, regardless of the cost. But still, process maturity does influence your costs. It has a direct relationship, because if you are trying to nail down a standardized process in your ERP platform, and your business is still not clear on how it's going to handle processes that should be pretty clear. If you are going to be implementing a D365 ERP system, if you are going to be implementing D365 and your processes are not mature, then it is harder for your organization to make stable business decisions or firm decisions, because your process is still in a growth phase. Your company is still in a growth phase, to the point where the way you do something today will be significantly different from the way you do something 3 months from now, or 6 months from now, or even a year from now. And while the systems are built with flexibility to handle change, it is not recommended to implement, because you're making really significant design decisions in the very beginning. How are you going to set up your item master? What kind of workflows are you going to set up? What features of the software you're going to set up? There are some aspects of software where once you do the initial setup, it's not very easy to reverse some of the core settings, right? There's flexibility, but with limitations. So having an unstable process will impact the design, will extend the length of design, and also make it harder for people to make decisions and stick to those decisions, right? And a lack of documented knowledge will also have an impact on your design and making decisions that are going to be used to configure the system or to make some modifications. If you are modifying software on the grounds of a business process that's going to change, that's an expensive mistake to make, and you want to avoid that. Next is your project team, right? You want to have a team that's able to contribute. They have the knowledge of the processes. They're committed to the goals. They are able to learn and train and have the dedication to stay with the company after you're going live. Because without that stable core team who can share that knowledge, right, and to maybe even move things that are in tribal knowledge into documented knowledge, you are ensuring that you have the right people that are going to be there to support you during and after, and also you have the right team that is going to also be champions of that software and cut down on the amount of time you keep pushing out the project. And okay, so let's move on. So the size of your implementation is also important. How many people will there be? That's going to have a direct impact on the licenses that you will need to purchase, the sites that are affected, and that will also influence how many things that needs to be configured. For example, if you are an organization that you have a flagship store and you have a corporate office and you maybe have 2 or 3 locations, then your setups for your sites and warehouses is relatively minimal compared to an organization that may have a footprint of, let's say, 100 stores, a manufacturing facility, and some other sites overseas. Then the amount of setup required to get your instance up and running is also going to be a significant cost, right? Because it's important to get those configurations configured, tested, and verified, and then get all the relevant people trained. And training itself could be delivered in a number of manners such as onshore. You also have training for the individuals that are going to be working from those various sites. And the training could be delivered remotely through a webinar. But in many cases, you may want to pull different groups together into a common central location and deliver training. Also, something to consider are process differences at these sites. So either you're going to be designing a system with different processes at the sites, which is not best practice, or you would need to spend time to standardize processes as much as is possible at the various sites before you make firm design decisions in the system. All right. And another factor is the timeline. I would say avoid unrealistic timelines because you end up burning out, I think, a lot of resources looking for a never. And finally, we come to timeline. We want to avoid unrealistic timelines where we rush so many of the important design an analysis to targeting an unrealistic date. And I think what I've seen this do is create opportunity for wasted energy and wasted resources. Use realistic timelines. Dedicate the appropriate time for your resources to do the analysis, for your SMEs to work with the consultants to um, thoroughly flesh out the system, considering all the important points, um, without rushing to this date that's really not realistic and not going to happen. Okay, so that really does it for the soft factors that I mentioned. Okay, so before we jump into the worksheet that I use for the analysis, I want to bring your attention to this. This slide here shows a range of rates that you will incur. I do have an asterisk on the highest and the lowest rates because they're not typical of most implementation projects, but they are not they're not rates that are false. I have seen these in the business, and they are real depending on the partner that you choose. But in most cases, your your high rate is going to be around $250, $260. Your mid-range hourly rate is going to be approximately 195, around that figure, and your low rate is going to be somewhere around 160, 165. Of course, this could vary, but generally speaking, these are what you're looking at. Now, if we look at these hourly rates and then we consider the time that we're investing in consultation fees um, and the various meetings that you're going to hold during the course of this implementation lifecycle, then those numbers will add up. And let's take a look at the costing sheet that I put together. So I have created this tool that will allow you to estimate the cost of implementing D365. And it's looking at a number of things. It's looking at the licensing subscription. It's looking at consultancy services across the various stages of the project. And it's going to take that data and project what your monthly costs are for licensing, your annual costs are for licensing, as well as what that cost will look like over a 5-year window. Now, this is based on MSRP prices. This does not factor in any discounts that you may receive through Microsoft for the various licenses that you will purchase. So please keep that in mind. We'll also be looking at and allowing you to perform an analysis comparing the various rates. We looked at the high rate. Remember that $500 value, the highest rate. Then there was that high rate, which was about $250. Then you have the medium rate, $195. Then there was a low rate at $165, and then the lowest rate was $60. Per hour, US dollars, right? We'll also take a look at the hardware devices that you would potentially be purchasing, and then we'll take into account how many consultants you have on the project when we look at your travel expenses, and also we'll look at the on-site visits, right? So let's start by looking at licensing. Suppose that you are an organization, you're operating supply chain, HR, you have a few HR users, you've got planning, finance and operations, so you're going to have some finance in there, and you have some warehouse staff as well as some engineers, and we're not going to do retail, but if you were doing retail, of course, you'd plug in those numbers. So with Microsoft Dynamics, recently Microsoft introduced some new pricing where there's a base price and an attached price for certain features of the software. So for example, if you need the supply chain management modules, then you'll pay for the base price of supply chain. And if your users are only using supply chain management and they're never using the financial modules, then they'll only purchase the supply chain module at the base price. If you wanted to, for example, attach a finance, then you would pay an additional 30 US dollars for that finance license, right? And similar, if you had a hugely financial organization and you just had a handful of supply chain users, you'd buy mostly the finance base price licenses, and then the supply chain, a few supply chain attached licenses for a handful of your users. And I'm not going to go into detail about the licensing module. I believe there is another talk that goes into details of this. But if you do have follow-up questions and you'd like to shoot them over, I can definitely help you to get those questions answered. Right? So imagine your organization has 3 buyers. So your 3 buyers, they're not doing anything financial, right? So they're just going to do the 3 licenses. And their base license is just going to be the supply chain. So we're going to say for those 3 licenses, it's going to be that $180 times 3. Now keep in mind, Microsoft still maintains that in order to be a user of D365, you need a minimum of 20 licenses. So that's going to be 20 base licenses, no matter what those are across the organization. You need 20 of those, right? So 20 unique base licenses, 20 unique users. Okay, so your buyers are not going to use the financial modules. They're not going to use retail and talent and the device SKUs. You've got HR, and I believe the HR, the human resources module, is still going to be falling under the supply chain, right? So it's either going to be under the supply chain or finance, but I believe it's going to be supply chain, right? And I do want to say that the functionality, whether you're buying the base price or attached price, it's not going to change. Like if your base price is your base license is on the supply chain, and you have an attached license for finance, then or if you have a base price for finance and your attached license is supply chain, they have this exact same functionality, exact same features available. It's just the pricing that is going to be different, right? Now, let's say you have your planners. These are your production planners. They're going to, of course, need the MRP, as well as a number of other features. They're going to be using supply chain. They're also not going to be using any finance. So let's say we have 10 planners in our organization. Those 10 planners, none of them are using finance. None of them are going to be using these other licensing categories. So we'll just leave it as 10. Now we have our financial team. Now the finance, they are going to be, let's say we've got a finance group of, let's say we've got 10 finance people, right? They need those 10 base licenses at 180. Now, if finance decides that they want to also have the supply chain module, right? The supply chain management features, then they would need to get 10, right? And so we started with, let's say, $1,800 for the 10 licenses, and we purchased another 10 attached supply chain licenses. $300 plus the $1,800 equals the $2,100, right? Now let's say your organization has about 20 warehouse staff. Of those 20 staff, let's say about maybe 5 of them or let's say 10 of them are going directly into the supply chain, and 10 of them are just going to be using the device SKUs, let's say. Right? So that's what our licensing costs are looking like so far. Now, for our engineers, Our engineers are not going to be using the finance. They're not going to be using retail. They're not going to be using talent or the device SKUs. So let's say we've got about 7 engineers in the organization. They're going to be using supply chain. All right, so you got your 7 times $180 brings you to $1,260, right? And we said we don't do retail staff here. Okay, so monthly you've got a cost of $9,010 MSRP. Annually, that number is going to be about $108,000, and then over a 5-year window, right? 5 years of use for all your users at MSRP price, you can project what those costs are. And of course, as I mentioned, you would work with Microsoft and through your partner of record to come to a nice licensing deal. So you get a pretty decent discount there, right? So you want to work towards that discount. Okay. So that's just looking at the licensing aspect. Let's look at the consultancy costs. All right, so to convey the point of those 10 soft factors that we talked about earlier in the presentation, I do want to look at the typical phases of an implementation project. This is a software implementation project. Most of the software is built, but we will be building out some custom features. There's still analysis and design and development and all that good stuff that still has to happen, right? So let's say we start out with this really tight timeline and said, yes, we want to get this implemented within a year, and these are the hours that we've estimated, and this is what we've got in our SOW, so this is what we're working towards, right? So starting out, if I'm working with this really high-priced partner with this unrealistic $500 an hour price, then here's what my cost is going to be to deliver this, right? Assuming nothing changes, right? That we've got a perfect team and we've got all our ducks lined up in a row, right? And at the lowest rate, here's what my cost is going to look like. Now, before I continue, I do want to jump over to the cost parameters. So we do have parameters established here. So this is the rate, right? So this is what we're using for comparison. And we do have some set values here. This is industry, for some of the industry most popular printers and hardware devices. These are the approximate costs for them, right? And I do have a parameter here to turn on projections. So if we want to turn on projections to look out over the next 5 years for consultant costs, then currently I have that turned off. I'm actually going to set that to no right now, and then head back into the main worksheet. Right now, this is not taking into account any ISV consultancy fees that you'll also incur. Right, so that's something that this worksheet doesn't take into consideration, and at some point I might further develop the tool to do that. Okay, so here we are. We start our project out, and we kicked off, and everyone's bright eyes and bushy tailed, and they're ready to implement. And then everyone, but we start in our analysis phase, and let's say we've got we're starting to see some resistance. We're starting to see that we don't have the really all the information that we need to understand what our strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats are in the company, right? So there's a lot of going back and forth in meetings and certain decisions that need to be made. So we've got what of our soft factors. We've got employees, your goals, and your scopes. Your project starts to balloon because there's certain decisions that are taking longer to make, and you're pulling in outside resources to help make some decisions for your business that you could potentially make without those outside resources. There's some activities that you can do internally before you invite the company over to consult, right? So this could be a factor of process maturity, not having certain things in place or decisions in place. This could be a factor of defining your clear goals and not trying to do too much, right? So imagine your estimate, it jumped from that 4,460 hours, and as the course of the project, as you go through the project, you'll notice that these hours start to balloon because we're dealing with some of the soft factors that are having a direct impact on your costs. So, for example, design, it might your requirements. You started out with a pretty clean list of requirements, but as you sit down with your team, that number balloons, right? Um, the number of additional requirements and modifications that you're looking to bring into the project, bring into scope, that grows. And look how our billable hours increases just through the initial phase of the project. Now, if the design, right, designing out the FDDs, if we're going for that big bang approach and we're not rather just looking at what the system is standardly able to deliver, working with that and keeping the customizations to a minimum, not only will we see the design increase, but the actual development hours, that could also increase tremendously, right? So we started with a 4,460, and we've already, through the process of the analysis through development, have increased tremendously. And that has a significant impact on your bottom line. And when you look at over your 4-year first year window, looking at the lowest rate, when you look at licensing, that's going to stay pretty consistent, right? Because if we say we need, how much was that, 50 users or whatever that number is, that number is going to stay the same. But what's going to change, right? Or that number is going to change potentially. But if you add in, like, say, additional requirements to say, well, we want to do vendor collaboration, and that's absolutely wonderful, but you want to factor things like that into your decision making process very early on, because if your vendor needs to log in, your vendor needs a license too, right? So here we are looking at projections for the cost at the lowest rate over that first year, right? Actually, not looking at projections, looking at the cost for the first year, looking at licensing, services, your hardware, as well as travel, right? And that number, of course, is going to grow based on the rate, right? So we looked at those parameters. So this is at the lowest rate. And then forget about it. Once you get to the high rate, that's a significant jump. That's a significant cost to your organization. So think about those soft factors. Think about employee acceptance of change, the influence your employees have on your organization. Think about resistance and morale. How long is that going to drag out your project, right? If you set a goal to implement within 12 months and the project is being keeps getting extended and pushed back because we don't have the right people showing up to meetings, we don't have people making decisions, we don't have people who are championing the project, then or we're constantly moving dates. That has a direct impact on the actual pocketbook, right? You're going to spend a lot more, and I don't think it's right. And I think there's a number of ways you can try to plan around that and address that. So we have these projections here. So going back up to this worksheet, the phase section of the worksheet, right? So if we can take a second to plan out, and not just a second, of course, you want to take time to plan out internally with your team. What are your key success factors? What are the absolute must-have? Can you on your team, before you bring in the consultants, can you bring your team together and list out what are the must-have requirements for your organization? And we're not talking about 10 pages. But we're also not talking about 10 records in Excel. We're talking about a really consolidated list that represents the respective business areas that you're targeting, um, and coming up with a certain understanding of what absolutely needs to be um, delivered for you to comfortably move from your current platform into D365, right? So if you can do that ahead of time, if you can also train your staff ahead of time on D365, then that gives them the ability to be prepared to implement the software, um, because they'll have a better understanding of what features are there. So that gives them a head start by the time it's time to really fully engage the consultants that are going to be coming on site. Okay, so I also have consultants, because we talk about on-site visits, right? Where on-site visit, roughly, it's based on the cost parameters. We're estimating that about $1,500 when you factor in airfare, hotel, um, per diems, rental cars, etc. Right? So we take that into consideration too. So depending on how much on-site present you require from your consultants, that's going to also impact your travel and expense fees. Now, in the grand scheme of thing, I will say that your travel and expense fees are, depending on what your starting price is. This is a typical, it's, I've seen this range from 2%, and this here, based on these rates and based on the number of consultants, this is up to 7. But of course, a large part of what you're going to be implementing is going to be, the cost is going to be mainly on the services side and licensing, right? And of course, that number is going to change based on how many people are in your organization. I was pretty conservative with my estimate of end users here, with my count of end users here. But if you're an organization that has a huge employee base that is going to be having direct access into the D365 platform, then of course your licensing costs are also going to be significantly higher. For example, there was a user who mentioned that they have, I believe, 2,700 retail staff. And of course, when you factor in for retail, that would bring that number much higher here when you look at your monthly, annual, and then your 5-year projections. Okay, so I think we're done with this worksheet for now. I will say that this worksheet is available, and I do share it with anyone who needs it. I've shared it with a number of people already who found this as a good tool as a starting point for them to come up with their estimations for their ERP implementation project. Okay, so now that we've looked at the worksheet, are there ways that we can um, try to mitigate some of the fees that we'll incur? Of course, there are. And one way is to provide. Are there ways that you can mitigate on your? Are there ways that you can mitigate the risk of really high service fees? Of course, there are. One way is to leverage a hybrid approach to your implementation where you're using onshore and offshore resources to support your project to get you through the analysis phase through your actual go live date. You can use onshore resources to help with the functional and technical, as well as you have offshore resources that can help with technical and functional, and that typically, the offshore model will have a heavier reliance on technical resources, but I've seen really a combination of um, of, of skill sets on the onshore and offshore side. So we do have there's some organizations that offer this. Synoptic is one of them, right? So you can have onshores that work on site directly with your team, and then your offshore resources would work primarily remotely overseas. And if work required, they can occasionally travel. And of course, there's benefits and disadvantage to everything. One of the main benefits is relatively fast development results with major cost savings. And one of the disadvantages is the limited face-to-face opportunities. Right? So here's an example of an offshore module where you have your functional and management level resources in the Americas, and your offshore team where you've got technical and functional delivery off, in India in this instance, right? So there are different ways that you can combine resources to get a more feasible or agreeable rate as you're implementing. I want to talk briefly about the on-premise um, option. So we know we have the cloud version of D365, which is wholly managed by Microsoft, and then you have the on-premises one. And something important to know is that while it's we use a terminology on-premises, it's the hardware. It's not located physically um, in your buildings, right, in your data center, but the servers um, will that support the service fabric must be on Microsoft Azure. So please keep that in mind. And if you're going to be using the on-premise version, right, your software must be updated periodically. And ideally, you want to do those updates monthly, and you can skip a maximum of 3 software updates. And here I list out some of the minimum on-premise requirements. And here I list out some of the minimum on-premise requirements broken out by network, bandwidth requirements, latency requirements, internet connectivity, and domain. If you're implementing on-premises, um, keep in mind that these are the features that you would not be able to have access to, right? So, for example, cost accounting, content pack for Power BI. Is it available on MS Cloud? Yes. Is it available on-premise? No. And here's the full list of features. Microsoft is also constantly adding a fuller feature set, so that list is subject to change. These are considerations that I suggest when you're planning your implementation, when you're planning for costs. Now, train your staff beforehand on the D365 for finance and operation. Get them familiar with functionality and features. They're not going to be, on par with consultants, necessarily. If for example, if this is their first exposure to a Microsoft Dynamics software platform, they're not going to have the full skill set of a functional resource that you're going to hire, right? It's going to come in through your partner, but at least let them have the appreciation of the features that are available in the software, so that while they're doing analysis, while they're working with the consultants for analysis, they're understanding this is not just soup to them. They're putting it all together. As you embark on your implementation, consider making these investments. Consider training your staff on the Microsoft Dynamics 365 and operations features. Give them an opportunity to learn how the software works, learn the general processes, whether it's procurement and sourcing, sales and marketing, your sales orders, your manufacturing. Give them the ability to understand the at least get an overview of what the software is capable to do before they're engaging with the consultants. I think you really enrich your staff with the skill sets that they're going to need, and I think overall this is going to save a lot of time, because a lot of times people are sitting in meetings and they're talking about the software, and it's still so theoretical. They're still so far removed from the software that it doesn't really, all the points don't really connect until they have an understanding of how things work, right? So if they're going through analysis and they're going through requirements, maybe there's an investment, a significant, maybe it's possible to bring someone on, and you make that investment to bring someone on for a week to sit with core people and provide a level of training so that they understand how the software operates before you bring in the consultants to start eliciting requirements. So another thing is when we get into these implementations, business intelligence is sometimes a second thought. It would be tremendously beneficial to your organization if you're training your staff on the Power BI tools ahead of time and giving them the opportunity to really build out their own reports, so that once you're ready to implement, right? One, business intelligence is not a second, an afterthought. And two, rather than to invest the resources and designing a report each time, you have the internal resource to help you with this type of development, right? So you're going to be enriching your internal team members and saving costs at the same time. And another suggestion I have is to purchase an additional Sandbox environment. It's approximately $450 per month. This environment would sit on Azure, but you want to have an environment where your end users can learn and demonstrate, because once Microsoft issues the environment to you, you're going to get two right away that you can touch, right? You're going to get your Sandbox, you're going to get your development environment. Your production environment's not going to be available to you right away. But you want an environment where the users who are learning have access to go in and create data without, fear of messing up anything. The Sandbox environment, you want to reserve that for your consultants to maintain the configurations. And your development environment is going to be too unstable for anyone to really do much in there. So I suggest getting that additional Sandbox environment. Okay, so I'm about to wrap up, but I just want to touch on the topic of briefly and on amortization. Now, when we look at the overall costs, we can amortize the travel expenses, such as hotel, per diem, flights, anything related to travel. We cannot amortize those, right? So, correction, you cannot amortize your travel expenses, your hotel, per diem, flights. But when it comes to your software, you can amortize these, right? Your hardware costs, your software costs, your licensing costs, you can amortize these. So keep that in mind. So just to wrap up, knowledge is power. Do your housekeeping before you bring the consultants in, right? If there are things within your organization process-wise that you want to address and focus on, like there's a reason why you're changing, right, to a new system. There's a reason. What are those reasons, right? What can you clean up process-wise in your organization? What kind of decisions can you make process-wise to help steer the ship to a successful implementation once you actually kick off this project? Empower your employees before, during, and after. Train them. Share information with them, and watch them thrive, right? Because if your employees are engaged, if they feel empowered, if they're contributing, it's going to contribute to the health of the project and ultimately help reduce the cost of that implementation. Select a partner who can align with your vision, right? What your vision is architecturally, what you want to implement, where you want to see your company within the next 5 or 10 years, and as well as a partner who's fair in pricing, right? And plan now, for now and for the future. Look at those costs. Again, I have the cost analysis worksheet that I can definitely share with you. I hope that this session has been helpful for you. I know it covers a whole lot, and I hope that you can appreciate the points that have been laid out. I have a list of suggested resources here for you. We've got 2 versions of licensing guides that talk about the licensing changes that came into effect on October 1st, 2019, right? And that's it. Thank you so much for joining. Again, my name is Nicolette Richards, and we are Synaptic, and we look forward to talking to you and helping you making your decisions as you move forward with this wonderful Microsoft D365 solution. Thank you.